Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice Podcast, episode 221. I'm the host, Kim Newlove. Today is the first interview in my Pharmacist Authors Series. I'm sharing interviews with 12 pharmacist authors and one audio engineer in June and July of 2023. Subscribe to or follow this podcast to get all these great interviews delivered right to your podcast player or YouTube each time a new one comes out. Join me for this series. Now, if you're new to the Pharmacist Voice podcast, welcome. I am a pharmacist by training. I went to the University of Toledo College of Pharmacy, and I graduated with my BS Pharm in 2001. But I'm not in clinical practice anymore. I am a voice actor and a podcast host. Among other things, I narrate audiobooks written by pharmacists. If you have a project in mind, whether it's an audiobook, medical narration, or something to do with podcasting, contact me through my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. Up first in my Pharmacist Authors Series is Dr. Salam Kabbani, author of COVID Long Hauler, My Life Since COVID. She also narrated the audiobook herself, and you'll hear a sample of the audiobook at the end of the episode. Salam is an infectious diseases pharmacy specialist in the Kansas City, Missouri area. I just got back from the Metapreneurs Conference in Kansas City, Missouri, and I actually got to meet up with and have lunch with Salam. It was amazing. She's wonderful to talk to, such a joyful and delightful person to be around. So I hope you enjoy our interview. During the first half, we'll talk about her book. Then, during the second half of the interview, we'll talk about her experience narrating her audiobook. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Salam Kabbani. Hi, Salam. Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice podcast.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for hosting me on your show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I am excited to have you here on the Pharmacist Authors Series here on the Pharmacist Voice podcast. You are the first interview of the whole entire series. How does it feel to be the first?
Very exhilarating. I am truly honored. Thank you.
Yeah, you betcha. This is going to be a great interview. We are going to talk about your book. I've got all the questions that I'm going to ask everybody else. But in addition, we're going to talk about your experience narrating your own audiobook.
Yes.
Salam, your book is called COVID Long Hauler, My Life Since COVID. How'd you come up with that title?
Yeah. So the first part is, as it sounds, COVID long hauler. And for those who may be listening and unfamiliar, long COVID, also known as, long COVID syndrome or long hauler syndrome, is a group of persistent symptoms that persist after COVID. It can be for as long as 6 months to even years in some people. And so that's what I've been experiencing. And the second part, which is my life since COVID, that was specifically chosen with the terminology since as opposed to after, because even to this day, I'm still experiencing some long COVID symptoms. And so it's kind of an ongoing process.
Well, I'm glad that you are healthy and here with me today to talk about your book. It sounds like, of course, you have some authority on the topic. You have had COVID multiple times, and you talked about it in your book. Is there anything else you'd like to say about why you wrote this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started writing the book, this was back in January or February of 2022. And at the time, I wasn't seeing much about long COVID on the news. Many people didn't even know that this was a thing, including many providers. And so I wanted to raise awareness. I also wanted every long hauler out there to know that they weren't alone. It was very isolating for me, especially at the time, without the media coverage because many people in my circle got COVID and fortunately they recovered very quickly. So it was hard for me to understand, as well as for those around me, why was I not recovering? Why was my situation different? But I knew that I wasn't the only one out there. And so I just wanted every long hauler to know that they matter and, they're seen and they're heard and they're not alone.
That's good that you found a way to connect with them without actually meeting them, because people look for information, don't they? They Google stuff. And wouldn't it be nice to talk to somebody who's in the infectious disease space, who's had COVID? That's a great connection.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a very large community on Instagram, even through TikTok, Facebook, all the social media avenues, you name it. You will find long haulers out there. And it is a really great way to connect, especially for those who've been truly disabled by long COVID and maybe aren't able to meet in person or don't feel safe doing that because they may be at risk of reinfection. And so it's definitely a great community out there.
Now, are you on TikTok? I'm just curious.
I am. I will say I'm a millennial. And so I'm on TikTok in the capacity of maybe posting one video every 3 months. So I have a long ways to go. But I am technically on there.
All right. TikTok and Clubhouse are two forms of social media I just never got into. I don't dislike them. I just don't have time for one more thing, Salam.
I don't even know what Clubhouse is. So you're one step ahead of me.
I guess it's audio. It's kind of like a
Okay.
social media app where people get up on some stage and talk, and I have never experienced it. I haven't even gone on YouTube to look at it. I digress. Sorry.
That's
back,
okay.
back to the book. All right. You talked about already kind of having an audience there on Instagram, or a community that you can
Yes.
connect with. But as far as who should read this book, who's the audience? Who should read this book?
I honestly think that everyone can read this book and truly enjoy it. And I know that many people are going to see the title and be skeptical. We're all sick of COVID, right? We just want to put the pandemic behind us. And for those who maybe have long COVID, I'm assuming like myself, the bandwidth is not very great right now. And, you're already suffering. You don't want to hear about someone else's suffering. However, I counter that by saying, the book is a memoir. I'm not talking about the disease. I'm not talking about politics. It's literally a recounting of what I went through. And it does have a sort of satirical take on things that I went through, things that you don't think of. For example, when I was quarantined, I ran out of towels and then I had to order a bunch, or even, underclothes and having to order more underpants, things like that. So it does have some satire to it, but most importantly, it's really just raising awareness while also spreading empathy. And I think that, the more we are moving out of the acute phase of COVID, the more we're learning how many people are suffering from long COVID. And it might be simple things like some people just continue to feel a little bit tired. Some people have never recovered from that. And so just really understanding, what your friends or your neighbors or yourself might be going through, whether it's on a small or a large scale. I think you will get that from my book. And it'll also be a fun way to kind of look at the pandemic, look back and see the different things that we've all gone through and how some of us, have been able to move past that. And then unfortunately, some of us are still dealing with some of those things.
Yes, I'm sorry that you're experiencing the physical characteristics,
Thank
the
you.
the long haulers syndrome. But one thing that you talked about just now is that it's something you can look back on and just remember the pandemic, like what it was like, how hard it was to leave your house when you're under quarantine. And yeah, you can look back on it and be like, whoa, that was real life back then. And I mean, it's got some historical value.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. I am, for those who are listening, I actually am an infectious diseases pharmacy specialist. So it's very ironic that I've been reinfected multiple times with COVID. But, even now at our hospital, we don't have to wear masks anymore unless someone, has COVID or something. And it's just so different, what we went through even last year compared to now. So I'm glad that we seem to be moving out of that.
Yes, some of the normalcy, so to speak. Yeah,
Yes.
I use air quotes. Normalcy is kind of descending back on our country. But at the same
Yes.
time, when I listened to your audiobook, I listened to the whole entire thing. I kind of shook my head like, yep, that's how we do it. Yep, yep. And then you talked about going to Universal Studios as a
Yes.
vacation type thing and ending up getting COVID again.
Yeah.
And it's I know we laugh about it now, but back then, I don't think you would have taken the risk had you known that could actually happen. I mean, did you know that could happen?
I was very cautious. I was very scared, when I went to Universal Studios, that was probably the roughest timing for my long COVID. I had very intense pleuritis. I had muscle aches. I was actually in a wheelchair at Universal Studios. And for those that are listening, I was fully able-bodied before. This was purely long COVID. So I was very cautious, but this was March of 2021. And at the time, the CDC was reporting the lowest rates as of yet for new infections. And so I thought that I was golden. Everyone was saying, oh, COVID's over. So I literally took my mask off for the very first time since I had gotten infected. And, as luck would have it, I got reinfected. I think I did actually talk about that in my book, and I can't say definitively. However, I do think I might have still elected to go to Universal Studios. I just might have masked up only because I had been essentially bedbound for so long by that time. And I needed a rush of adrenaline of something just to feel alive. And, I would literally, my cousin, he's so sweet. He was kind of pushing my wheelchair. So he would push me up to the roller coaster. I'd get on, felt great, and then get right back in the wheelchair. So I think I would have still gone, just maybe been a little more cautious.
Well, those activities feed our souls. We need that.
Yes.
Absolutely. But you do bring up some interesting points of things that you experienced being in a wheelchair. Not everybody that experiences COVID ends up being in a wheelchair. In the book, you talked about going through speech therapy. You talked
Yes.
about online dating during COVID.
Yes.
There's a lot of historical value in there because you couldn't just go out and see people because we were, quarantined at certain points or, it didn't feel comfortable anyway. Some of us did
Yes.
not feel comfortable leaving the house to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, having this long COVID experience, and for me, I will preface by saying that I'm very fortunate where as of right now, I have recovered so much of my previous capacity. And so I can kind of look back at it like it's something in the past. And I know that not every long hauler, has that same experience. So I am very grateful to be here today and be able to talk about it in this manner. But I will say that it kind of put me through the ringer. I experienced what it was like to go from being fully able bodied to slowly deteriorating, having a whole bunch of disseminated symptoms, whether it was the GI tract, whether it was the central nervous system, whether it was, the muscular system, and just needing a cane to then needing to be in a wheelchair to some days even literally just stepping out like from the bed to, sitting in a wheelchair. That was just too much. And I will say, I think the pleuritis was the worst of it all because just breathing hurt, I felt trapped in my own body. And sometimes people would try to make things better by saying, oh, you have to keep a positive attitude. And I know that that comes from a positive place or, they have good intent. But for me, that was literally the worst thing that anyone could say because, science is real. We all know that sometimes whether you have a great attitude or a bad attitude, sure, it might help your mental health, but that's not necessarily going to change the outcome of your actual illness. And so, anyways, it did give me the opportunity to empathize with so many people that I don't think I would have had the opportunity to do so otherwise. And looking back, I am very grateful for all the experiences that I went through. It's definitely made me a better healthcare provider. I know what it's like to sit in a hospital bed and how scary and terrifying that is. And so I am very grateful for that experience as challenging as it was.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about the empathy. I know that you are a cat owner, But
Yes.
I even heard some empathy for dog owners in this
I know.
book. The cat owners are loving on the dog owners. What's going on here? Empathy. That's what's going on. Empathy.
I mean, seriously, especially when, Delta was rampant and we were so scared to like even leave our houses. It's hard. If you live in an apartment and you're supposed to be isolating, you got to walk your dog. And I don't know what people did, but, things I would have never thought of before.
Yeah. Well, that's what memoirs are for. So I'm sure there's somebody
Yes.
with a dog that had COVID or long COVID that probably wrote a memoir about that. So we'll have to look that up.
Yes. Compare and contrast.
Yes. All right. We already talked about who should read this. And the next question I have, I think you've kind of already answered, but why should anyone read this book? What problem does it solve? Or what do you want readers to get out of this book?
What I want readers to get out of this book is really just an understanding of what many people in society are going through. What's surprise, and I say surprising, but it's really not that surprising. Um, I talk to so many people that after I tell them my story, they're like, "Oh my God, I think I might have long COVID." Especially for people that were hit with it, but not as strongly as people that had to seek higher level of care. And the reason that I think it's important to know if you do have symptoms is because there are some things that can be done. For example, one thing that's still persistent for me is sound sensitivity. Some days it's fine. Like today, thankfully, I'm not having any of that. But some days it's just, for lack of a better expression, I think in the book, I literally say it makes me want to rip my face off. And that's how I feel inside. Even my own voice is just overpowering for my central nervous system. And so, if you recognize that maybe that's something you're going through, well, there are some really nice noise reducing headphones that have been made especially for individuals who are maybe neurodivergent or have a chronic illness or, for whatever reason are experiencing that. And so I think the first way to get a solution is to identify the problem. The other thing I'm hoping readers will get out is, if anything, just empathy, understanding, why maybe your coworker called off sick. Maybe they just had a debilitating episode of POTS or postural orthostatic tachycardia. And so they weren't able to come into work. And finally, that last part of your question, I think that the biggest stage right now is awareness and patient advocacy. I will give you my own anecdotes. I have two medical bills now that I was recently sent. One was for $6,000, believe it or not, and one was for $1,200. Both of those things, the insurance had told the hospital at the time that they would be covered, and now they are reneging. And I think part of what's happening with a lot of long haulers is insurance companies are saying, well, there's no, randomized clinical trials to prove that this therapy is actually going to cure long COVID, even though maybe the patient has responded. And that's really challenging, right? I mean, I'm a pharmacist and I can't afford that, you know? And so I think raising awareness will hopefully help keep long COVID in the news so that we can push forward for better laws, for better access to care and have insurance hopefully cover some of that.
That's so disappointing to
I
hear
know.
that a lack of data. Gosh, I guess the last pandemic 100 years ago, we didn't have the data, but it
Right.
wasn't COVID though. This
Right.
has never happened before. Anyways, I digress. It just is disappointing to hear that insurers are using invalid arguments to deny claims. So again, I'm sorry that's happening to you. That is disappointing.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Let's talk about the book some more, shall we?
And let's do it.
All right. You did a great job answering those questions.
Thank
Now,
you.
I wanted to ask something that's kind of similar. When somebody has this book and they read it, what do you want them to do with the information?
That's an excellent question. I think going back to that empathy piece, I know I keep harping on it, but it's really big. I know for me, one of my biggest struggles, especially when I was, really struggling with long COVID, was feeling like a flake. And by that, I mean, I would make plans with friends and then cancel last minute. And that's hard for me because I try to really honor any promises that I make and want to keep them. But, long COVID, you're doing great. And then all of a sudden, maybe your blood pressure plummets, or maybe you start having these intense chills. There is so much that is unknown. You really just wake up and see how the day is going to go. Some days are great, some days are awful. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people to understand. I think it's
Mhm.
human nature. We all expect kind of a give and take in our relationships and our friendships, and that's fair. But I think it's also important to remember that, your friends or your family or your loved ones that may be experiencing this, they don't have ill intent. And so maybe you do kind of alter your boundaries. I know we all have to protect our own space, but I do think it's important to be cognizant of that. And the same goes for, the workforce. Maybe it means that some people might need some additional modifications. I am very fortunate. My manager is incredibly understanding. So there's been almost a 2-week period where I've worked remotely. So I'm still completing my job duties and everything, but I physically, if I'm struggling to walk that day, that makes it really challenging, right? So, raising awareness hopefully will provide care for those patients like myself. And so I think carrying that empathy and that awareness forward, that's really what I want anyone who reads my book to feel. And also for those long haulers to have hope. I never believed that I would get to where I'm at right now, a year ago. It's so wild to me, the difference in 1 year. And I will say, like, I'm involved in a clinical trial. I still don't know if I got the active drug or placebo. I suspect that I got drug because it has made a significant difference. But regardless, I'm doing so much better. And so I think remembering that there is hope, it may take a very long time, unfortunately. It's very aptly named, right? Long COVID. But it may get better. So definitely for those long haulers, I do want them to take away that message and just to know that, if anything, I care. I know a lot of people have reached out to me and said that, they've had family members cut them off, which is just insane. But, I think with the nature of COVID, being so political, I think, some people kind of went in that direction. But, for me, just thinking, when I was at my sickest, I'm so blessed. Like, I have such a solid group of close friends, my mom, my dad. I can't imagine having them cut me off when I was that vulnerable. And so for those people that are going through that, I care. And I want them to feel like my book is a hug. So yeah, there are, I guess, those two different messages based on who is reading it. But ultimately that's what I want the reader to leave with.
I like that. Your book is a hug.
Yes.
Such a friendly thing to say. I like that.
Thanks.
All right. Well, hey, as we wrap up the questions about the book and start to transition into the narration part, I just want to ask one final question. Where can my audience buy your book?
Absolutely. So it is currently on Amazon in EPUB or ePrint, in a physical copy as well as audiobook, also through Audible and through iTunes. I am working on trying to get it available through more avenues, but right now that's where it's at for the audio. And then the physical print can also be ordered from barnesandnoble.com as well as globalbookshelvesinternational.com, who is my amazing publisher. So those are all different avenues to get the book.
All right. Thank you. And I will put links in the show notes for anybody interested in buying that. And you have the audiobook available on Amazon, right?
I do, yes.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on narrating your own audiobook. Let's switch over and we're going to talk about that now.
All right. Yeah, it was so much fun. A little stressful, but very fun for the most part.
Well, congratulations on doing it. What made you want to narrate your own audiobook?
I felt like, it's a memoir, right? And also there are so many emotions. I think I'm a very animated person in general, just my personality. I do have a lot of intonations in my normal speech. And I felt like even though, I'm not Julia Whalen, for example, right? I'm not a famous audiobook narrator. I just did not think that anyone could really provide the best um just the best experience for the listener more than I can because I went through it. I wrote it. It's my life, it's my words. So I knew I wanted the reader to hear it from my perspective.
Yeah, you felt called to do it.
Yes.
Yeah, I can respect that.
Yes.
And how was the experience for you?
It was great. It was very different than I thought. I will say doing this has given me such a profound respect for any kind of performer, whether it is someone who talks on TV, narrates books, certainly any sort of musician. It is hard, I was recording for several hours on end and I thought, okay, I'll do half an hour, take a break. I was maybe 10 minutes in and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. It's just different than regular speech because you do have to have a certain cadence. And so it's challenging. Definitely an experience.
How is narrating an audiobook different from, for example, having a conversation with me here on the podcast?
Yeah, well, for starters, a conversation is back and forth, right? So when you're asking a question, I can pause and really just catch my breath. Whereas when you're narrating, you want to try to keep that flow going because you also want to make sure that your volume is consistent and everything is going to translate very well to your listener. And different depending on who's recording and how they're recording, that may make a difference. But for me, I was recording at a studio, and so I didn't necessarily have access to that all the time. So I also had to think about costs and things like that. So there's not as much liberty in terms of taking a break every 10 minutes if you need it. Otherwise, if you're really gonna those costs are gonna add up.
I believe your audiobook was approximately 3 hours in total runtime. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you said that you were in the studio recording for hours on end.
Yes.
For anybody listening who doesn't realize this, it is not just you press record and you record 3 hours of perfect audiobook narration without any mistakes. How many hours were you actually in the studio? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was 6 hours.
So that was at least double the amount of time of the final runtime. What advice do you have for pharmacist authors who are narrating their own audiobooks?
I will give them the advice that graciously gave to me. Practice, practice, practice before you actually go to record. It still might come out a little bit different, but the more that you rehearse, the easier it'll flow. And especially because, for me, I was thinking, well, I wrote these words, like I know them by heart, but it's still different, very similar to when you are preparing for a job interview, right? You know what you want to say if they're asking your standard questions, but you still come off much better if you actually rehearse ahead of time. So in that same vein, practice going through it at least once. I will say, make sure you're hydrated, have some throat lozenges that day. Maybe don't eat like a super heavy meal because I don't know what it was, but I think maybe just swallowing so much air, I found myself getting hiccups by the end of it. It was the weirdest thing. So I hope that wasn't too much information. Sorry, but like I said, I have so much respect for anyone who performs and records. And the biggest thing I think is, do your research on where you want to record. I won't go into too much detail, but I found a studio, and it turns out that that person was a little more versed in music production as opposed to ACX, which is the audiobook route. And so I ended up having to utilize someone else to make sure that the quality was excellent. And thankfully, that happened. But it was challenging. So make sure even check out the studio. I know one thing that was really rough for me is I had to stand most of the time, and that that made it really challenging. You
That's
want to,
surprising. Sorry. That's very
yeah,
surprising.
yeah. So you want to be able to have your book set down on a table in front of you. Things like logistical things, make sure to check them out before you commit to a studio.
This is all excellent advice. I love the advice about going to the actual studio to check it out because I would have never guessed in 100 years that you would have to have stood while
Yeah.
narrating. I mean, I need all my mental energy. I need all my mental energy just to read and focus on what I'm doing. I don't think I could stand at the same time. And people joke about walking and chewing gum at the same time. You think it's simple, but narrating and standing and keeping your balance and keeping the same distance from the microphone, it's all harder when you're standing and maybe swaying or your natural body language takes over and it takes you away from the microphone, and pretty soon you're over here and people can't hear you quite the same. So anyways, it's good advice, and thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, you bet.
Awesome. Let's talk about some of the other aspects of narrating your own audiobook. I'm sure that you put a lot of energy into the narration and a lot of just the hopes and dreams that this thing is going to turn out exactly the way that you wanted it to. Did it turn out the way that you wanted it to?
Honestly, no. I am very happy with how it turned out. But being fully honest, like I said, there were some logistical issues that I had not accounted for with the recording process. And it got to the point where I was feeling a little bit defeated by the end. And thankfully, I had my mom, who's always been my biggest cheerleader, and she recognized that I was just kind of burned out just from going through the whole process, re-listening to the audio time and again to make sure it was great. And so she encouraged me to keep pushing forward. And thanks to you, I was able to connect with someone else who was fantastic. So she honestly did a really good job in like smoothing it over, and everything sounds fantastic now. It just wasn't necessarily published on the same timeline that I had hoped that it would. And that's really what I mean by it didn't turn out the way that I wanted it to. I was hoping to have that big release on the same day as the book and everything. And unfortunately, it didn't work out exactly that way. But in terms of quality and sound and everything, thankfully, Julie, who was the engineer that helped me, did a fantastic job. So, yes, it did.
Awesome. And that's Julie from Whole Story Studio, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. She's fantastic.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes, I think so as well. I have loved working with Julie, and she loves that I have kind of introduced her to nonfiction medical type stuff, medical books,
Yeah.
because she was previously not in this genre. So I think she's really enjoyed working with you as well because
Oh,
we're both pharmacists.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she even sent me like a little card after I finished recording with her, and these cute little decals that are like I recorded, and she's very professional and very sweet.
Awesome. I'm glad you ended up having a good experience on the back end where
Yes.
the files got all cleaned up, they got
Yes.
uploaded, and they are now for sale. And
Yes.
speaking of sales, what is it like selling an audiobook? Has that helped you sell more copies of your printed book as well? Or have you sold many copies of your audiobook? I know it's been only a couple of months since it's out, but tell me what's that like?
Yeah, so as of right now, I've actually sold a lot more print than audio. We've sold, and I say we, me and my publisher, we've sold over 100 books, which for my humble memoir, I I'm considering that a pretty big success. I know I'm not Colleen Hoover, but I'm happy with those numbers. With regards to the audio, I think I've sold 4. And so, that's obviously a very big difference. I will say, I think there's 2 reasons for that. Part of it is that I haven't gotten the chance to put as much marketing into the audio after it came out. Work has just been very, very busy. And so because I think the audio came out either the last day of December or like very early January, if I remember correctly. And we've just been slammed at work. So that definitely might be a big part of it. And also I know from the Bookstagram community, which I inhabit, a lot of members like to listen to audiobooks through, like Libro FM or Scribd or different avenues where they can listen to a book for free or like at a reduced cost, even through the library. And so that's a little different than Audible, right? So I am trying to get my book uploaded onto those websites. That way, increase exposure and hopefully more people are interested in listening to it.
Yeah, it takes a while to promote a book. So
Yes.
and an audiobook. So yeah, just keep at it, and yeah, I wish you all the best with that.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I ask you just a couple more questions, then we'll wrap this up?
Of course.
Now, before you narrated your own audiobook, what was your experience with performing? You said earlier that you didn't realize how much effort it was to perform as an audiobook narrator.
Let's just say that the 2 or 3 TikTok reels that I have are the extent of my experience.
Well, thank you for being honest.
You're welcome.
There may be some pharmacist author out there listening to this who has other performance experience, who's
Yeah.
thinking, oh man, she is scaring me. I no longer want to narrate my own audiobook. But what you're saying is, maybe if you had played an instrument and had that exposure of performing live, or maybe if you had your own podcast or something and you had experience being in front of a microphone, would that have been different for you?
I think it would have been different, and I think I'm inadvertently making people scared. So I'm glad that you brought that up because I would go back and do it all over again. It's not that the experience itself was scary. I think it's just really important to kind of do your research up front just to be better prepared. So I would have, for example, one of the days that I went to record, it was right after work. I was already kind of dehydrated. And because, you're working all day, you're not drinking water, just feeling a little tired. And that's fine. It all worked out. But even just having the energy to, be sonorous and read for, several consistent hours. It's not scary in and of itself. It's just that it requires a lot of preparation. So I hope that anyone listening to this does not get discouraged. Like I don't plan on publishing another book, but if that ever happens, I would narrate it all over again. I would just be a little more prepared and strategic about the timing of when I record those sessions. So on a weekend as opposed to a weeknight, which is what I did.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that you had gone through an entire work day, then
Yeah.
recorded. I mean,
Yes.
that takes a lot of, I guess, energy in addition
Yes.
to what you've already expended at work. So, yeah, that can be tough because you have to be engaging and enthusiastic and energetic when you narrate, and doing it after a day as a pharmacist. Oh, God
Yes.
love you. That's tough. Much respect.
Thanks.
All right. Now, a couple more questions, then I'm going to wrap
Yeah.
this up, I promise. I thought that your book might be good for a book group. Have any book groups picked up your book yet?
Not to my knowledge. Um, to be fair, I, just moved to a new city. I'm just meeting new people, just joining new groups. So again, there's not much awareness about my book out there. I will say that where I used to live, we had our own Redwood Readers book club. And my book got published after I left the Redwood area, but several of those members read the book and they did say they really loved it. And even though, we were seeing each other pretty frequently, they still like there were some things that they didn't realize I was going through. So it was really nice to kind of get that feedback and to see that even the closest people for me still kind of left with something new, a new take home message, if you will. So that's the extent of a book club, but I am hoping to, get the word out there more and hopefully it gets picked up.
Yeah, I would love to see library groups,
Yes.
you know what I'm talking about? Library groups, or maybe even, I don't know if pulmonologists or infectious disease doctors have patients that form support groups when they have long
Yes.
COVID. I could see those types of individuals picking up this book and having a discussion about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Sell, sell, sell.
Yes. Thank you for the support.
Yeah, you betcha. And last question, have you gotten any speaking gigs or podcast interviews because of your book?
I have, yeah. I was actually on the forgive me, this was a few months ago. I think it's called The Detroit Show. It's like the Detroit version of NPR. That was so exciting. It was a live broadcast and they invited me on just because there is so much buzz about long COVID. Someone saw my book that worked there and recommended it to them. And it was just a really great opportunity. And I actually got to connect with a caller who was, real life patient. And that was just such a rewarding experience.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad you got to get some more attention to your
Thank you.
book and the issue that you're trying to talk about. That's good.
Yes.
And you helped a caller. Who knew?
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been on a few other podcasts and hopefully have some more lined up. So I'm really excited.
Awesome. Well, you landed yourself on this podcast, my friend.
Right? It's an honor.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have you here. And I want to open up the floor to you to mention anything else you'd like to as we wrap this up. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Yeah. My last kind of shameless plug, if you will, for my book. I really do encourage people to read it and pick it up. I know that we're all trying to move past COVID, but it really is a satirical take. I don't think anyone is going to pick it up and, feel like they're trapped in the pandemic all over again. It's a funny, empathetic, kind of touchy feely, funny memoir all at the same time. We did mention that bit about dating and what that was like. And, there's all sorts of stories in there. It's a very quick read, and I highly encourage everyone listening to pick it up.
Absolutely. Or listen to the
Yes.
audiobook.
Yes.
I listened to the audiobook. I did not read the actual book. Full disclosure.
Yes.
Yeah,
No.
I enjoyed it. And it was kind of cool to hear you. And you were talking about satire just here on this podcast. There was satire in it. And I could hear the smile in your voice when you were delivering some lines that you thought were funny. And they were indeed funny. I
Well,
appreciated
thank
them.
you. I appreciate that. That's the
You're
highest level of praise coming from you, Kim.
Well, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Well, hey, Salam, thank you so much for being here on the Pharmacist Voice podcast to talk about COVID long hauler, my life since COVID. And everybody, pick up a copy of this. Get your warm hug from Salam.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. You take care.
All right.
Great interview. Thanks again, Salam. Next, I'll share a sample of the audiobook. And after that, I'll wrap up with some closing comments. So stay tuned.
Things no one tells you. Being quarantined for 14 days sounds pretty straightforward, right? Wrong. If you don't have a washing machine at home, you run out of clean underwear very quickly. So, you end up having to spend money on express shipping for new undies, and then you feel gross wearing them without washing them first. But really, what's the alternative? You also have to buy clean towels, unless you are super rich and bougie, and if you are, please adopt me and pay off my student loans. You probably don't have enough towels to circle 40 days. Okay, I didn't shower every day for 40 days because I was pretty much disabled, but let's say on average 5 days a week. That's a whopping 28.57 towels. I have about 6, and I'd like to think that's average. So yeah, my dad dropped off a few clean ones once he was back in town, But then I had to order more. Now, I wasn't quarantined for 40 days, but I had no strength to carry a laundry hamper or anything else really to go to my parents' house and do laundry. My mom was across the country during all of this. As selfish and needy as I wanted to be, I recognized that my hospitalized grandma that speaks no English was in more need of my mom's company than me, so she was with her. And if you are wondering why my cardiologist dad, who seems to work 24/7, didn't do my laundry, ooh, buddy, we need to have a serious discussion about realistic expectations on the work-life balance of physicians. Anyhow, the towels were bought, the lady was able to stay clean, and the laundry hamper casually expanded into empty grocery bags that were being temporarily stored in the linen closet. You spend a ton of money on services such as DoorDash because how else are you going to get food delivered to your door? In my case, both my parents were out of town initially, and while I have the kindest neighbor on the planet, I was not going to give her a grocery list. Especially because when your body has its own gastrointestinal palooza going on, one day you may be eating normally, and the next you may not be able to stomach anything but yogurt and pudding. A fickle body like that is surely not going to trouble anyone with a constantly evolving grocery list. Now here is the kicker. When you live in an apartment complex, where do you throw out your trash? If you open your door, you very well may run into a neighbor and expose them. When you go to throw away the trash, even if you are wearing gloves, you are touching the same lid that everyone else is, so you still have a chance of exposing them. You can't put your trash in your backyard area because you live in Humboldt County and bears will literally come into your backyard and tear into that bag. So what do? You store all your trash inside one of your bathrooms for 14 days and keep the fan on to air out the smell. I mean, how luxurious is this sounding? Okay, Shark Tank idea. I'm thinking we open a spa with these features and call it, wait for it, the COVID experience. I really wish I had taken a picture for the brochure right around now, but we can just be creative with our words, guys. We are a team. But on a real note, for people who only have one bathroom in their household, this can become a serious problem. I don't know what the best solution is, but if you were or are in that position, I am sorry, and I applaud you for making it out of the trenches alive. You need a pet to survive. Okay, maybe that's my exaggerated opinion. However, as much catitude as my Luna has, having something furry and purry cuddled up next to me in my darkest hours was one of the most comforting feelings I could possibly have. I also realize I'm very lucky that I chose to have a cat and not a dog because seriously, if you live in an apartment building by yourself, how do you take your dog out every day and not break the quarantine? Luckily, I did not have to deal with that problem, but my heart goes out to all the dogs and their owners who did. I know, it is always the dogs that suffer.
Great job, Salam. I give her a lot of credit. Narrating audiobooks is harder than it looks. I had a very, very small part in helping Salam prepare for her narration experience, and I must say I'm proud of her for doing it. I'm proud of her for seeing it across the finish line, and I enjoyed the performance. If you are a pharmacist author as well and you need help narrating your audiobook, message me through my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. I can help you too. If you'd like to buy a copy of COVID Long Hauler, My Life Since COVID, it's available in print and audio. Where can you find it? You can find it in a few different places. First of all, I recommend you go to Global Bookshelves International. That's the publisher, and you can find that at globalbookshelves.com. You can also find the printed book on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. If you want the audiobook, there are two places I would recommend. Shop on Audible or iTunes. Audible or iTunes for the audiobook. All right, that's all I've got for you today. Let's wrap this up. Thank you for joining me for episode 221 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes today, you'll find links to Salam's book in print and audio, her social media links, and more. If you know someone who'd like to read COVID Long Hauler, My Life Since COVID, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, Please subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each episode right when it comes out. Join me for the next episode, which is on Monday, June 12th. It's my interview with audio engineer Julie Walthers. She's from Whole Story Studio, which you can find at wholestorystudio.com. Thanks for listening today. I'll talk to you on Monday.